becoming exempt is not like a promotion. It's not a sign you made it. It's like we're going to suck your life away and not pay you. Just kidding. That's not it.
No,
But
no.
you know what I'm
Sometimes.
saying. How do you want to be? Do you want to be a contractor that takes on more clients? Do you want to be an employee? Like, what relationship do you want? And making sure that you're clear about that when you're starting. Yo, I want to be hourly for my entire life.
Hey, Jackie, welcome back to Keep What You Earn. Excited to have you back on.
Hello, Shannon. Thanks for having me. Excited to dive into this episode.
Yeah, anytime. So, because there's always questions that come up related to hiring team, paying them. This is one of like the most common questions I get as a CFO is like, can I hire a team? And then it's, who do I need to hire? What do I need to hire? How do I need to hire? It's the whole set of questions.
Yep.
And of course, I tell them I have plenty of people who do that, and you're one of them. And what I want to talk about today, and actually, let me before I go into that, reintroduce yourself to our audience. For those who haven't met you on the prior episodes, tell us what you do.
Yes, for sure. So I'm Jackie Koch, and I am a hiring and recruiting expert and people leader. I have my own consulting business that I help entrepreneurs and kind of early stage startups figure out the whole people strategy, hiring strategy, and work through that as they're scaling and growing.
Perfect. And that's what we need so badly, because I think people get overwhelmed so easily with the whole idea of hiring and bringing on a team. It feels like, you know, 1 minute you're a brand new baby business and now you're an employer and you're like, wow, what does this all mean? And that's why I love having you on the show to break it down. So today we're going to talk about employees and contractors, because I know I get this question a lot. I know you get this question a lot in terms of which one do I need and how do I know which one to hire? What is the most common question you get around employee versus contractor when someone's looking to bring on a team member?
Well, I would say the most common I wouldn't say it's a common question. It's more they don't really even know that there's a difference. Right. So it's almost like crickets. Like I'm more like educating them that there is a difference and that they do have to think about it. A lot of times people just think a contractor is an employee or vice versa. And so I would say the most common thing isn't actually a question, but it's more just like a general unawareness that there's a difference.
Yeah. And I think that, and a lot of people use it interchangeably. Like they'll say employees and they just mean anyone who works with them. And you got to be careful with that because they have real meanings behind those words. Could you just break down like a little bit of the difference in your own words? And then why is it so important to understand that difference and get it right?
For sure. For sure. I think that, the best way to talk about it, instead of calling everyone employees, like they can be your team, right? And your team can be a mixture of contractors, freelancers, employees, full-time employees, part-time employees. It can be a whole slew of people that make up your team. And I think that's a better, just overarching word to use that is less confusing. But the difference is, and really, I think freelancer and contractor are pretty much the same thing. They are not employees of your business, meaning there's not a employer relationship where you have to abide by various employment laws or abide by various like tax and payroll laws. There's different definitions that qualify, different tests, I guess would be a better way to describe it, that you should think about, or like checklists to think about on how you are categorizing someone, because you don't just get to like choose, oh, I'm going to make you an employee, or, oh, I'm going to make you a contractor. Like there's certain things that have to be met.
Right. What I hear all the time are people who come to me and say, Shannon, I talk to them and they want to be a contractor or they want to be an employee. So I'm going to make them that. And what a lot of folks don't understand is that's not really up to you. There's not,
or
this
them.
isn't, or them. It's not a choice. It's basically how the law is written and what your interpretation would be of these tests that you mentioned, right?
Yep.
So we look at 3 factors. It's levels of control. There's behavioral control, financial control, and relationship control. And those different dimensions, and that's all on the IRS website. There's actually formal guidance and a questionnaire to fill out about your employee relationship or your contractor relationship. But ultimately, it comes down to the level of control, right? So how much control do you want to have over how the person works with you? And that can dictate, leaning one way or the other on the needle, whether they're an employee or a contractor. And then it also varies where they're located, right?
Exactly. Yep. And so I think one thing, what came to mind as you were talking about that is a lot of times people think full-time hours equates to employee status, and
Yeah.
part-time means you're a contractor. And that is not true at all. You can have part-time employees. There's part-time employees in a lot of different businesses. And so I think that's also a distinction that we can make for your listeners is full-time doesn't automatically mean employee or vice versa. So I think that's super important. And when you say control is like, how much influence or say do you want to have in the hours that they work, the tasks that they do? Like a true contractor should be able to dictate all of those things on their own and use their own judgment as to when they do their work, right? So like you think about the gig economy, like Uber drivers, right?
Right.
Lyft drivers, they get to choose when they sign into the app and when they don't. But then when they are working, they accept jobs, they don't accept jobs. Like they're not required to be on the app from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. for their shift, right? They get to pick when they do it. That's the same as contractors working in your business. They should be able to choose when they work and how they get the work done. And so that's what you mean. That's part of what the control means.
Right.
And that's from a federal, like you mentioned the IRS website, right? Like that is like a federal United States requirement. But then each state also has different requirements. And there's some states that have a lot more stricter requirements than others, California and New York being two of them. And so it's like you gotta look up what those requirements are when you're hiring in those states to make sure that you're in compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And the definitions are narrowing for contractors.
100%.
What we have to remember is what's in the best interest of our governments is more employees. Why? Because that's more payroll taxes. Because generally from a tax lens, it's more favorable to be a contractor and hire a contractor. So what states are doing are they're cracking down on misclassified employees who are going out and pretending to be contractors, or where the employer or the hiring company is bringing on contractors that really should be employees because they do exert that control. Maybe they have those shifts. They dictate how the work is done and provide the tools and materials and so on. And they're trying to say they're contractors, but in reality, they're cracking down on that now. And I think it's only spreading. I think more states are starting to pick on that.
You know what could be interesting I know from my experience, like things that can happen that triggers the big brother looking into it. But could you share from your perspective, like from a financial and maybe like tax perspective, like what would trigger them to look into it? And then I can talk about from like the employer side, because sometimes situations happen that are not directly related to taxes that can trigger it.
Totally. So let's say it depends on which party you are. So really quick, if you're the employer, right, you're the company that's hiring out, one thing to look out for is, so we've mentioned this on the podcast before, but there's this thing called the NAICS code on your tax return, which tells you what industry you're in. So one way, and this isn't the only way, but this is the first front of mind thing to answer that, is if a company sees that you are a certain type of business. Maybe it's one that that really commands having employees. It would make zero sense to have contractors. Maybe it's like a retail business and you have clerks and things like that. It's like, those are employees because they have shifts. They have, like when I worked at McDonald's, I'm like, that was blatantly an employee relationship. I had a uniform, I had a method I had to follow, I had hours, right? And I had to work there. You couldn't
You
work from home. So you think about that. And if you look at that and then you look at the tax return and there's $0 under wages and like $300,000 in contractor expenses, it's like, that doesn't seem to make sense. Yeah, interesting. So it's always coming down to when the government will find it is when the story doesn't line up with what the expectation is. So whenever they examine tax returns, and they have AI that's coming out to look at these types of things, especially the federal government. So I would say when you're looking at like your financials, it's like, well, if there's a massive contractor expense, nothing under wages, that could be something they look at and just dig further into. They're not assuming you're committing some type of tax fraud. They're just going, I want to know more about this. How is it that you have all contractors and no employees in this type of business? And then on the employee or contractor side, if you want to be what we call a Schedule C, and you want to be a 1099 contractor, but you're really kind of behaving like an employee, one way to see that is, are you working for any other companies? Are you making income beyond one 1099 that you're getting from that company? So are you getting multiple different 1099s? Yeah. So if you're putting yourself out as a freelancer, are you posting on job boards? Are you actively seeking work? Are you out there really promoting yourself and your business? And it also helps if you have things like an LLC, business cards, and things with your business name on them, so that it really kind of gives off the scent of, I'm a contractor, I have my own business, and they hired my business. So that's one thing to look for, is how to like present in the way that you want to, not to lie, but how to enhance your presentation to show that you are what you say you are.
I never thought about that, because like, so I could, for example, like I'm a contractor, right? Like I could get audited. And then if I only have one, W-9, they would then go audit that company. And then they could see, oh, they're misclassifying all of their contractors, and it could lead that way. That's an interesting thing.
Potentially, if it's worth their while, it's big numbers, right? If they're gonna go through that trouble with the 3 people that work at the IRS right now.
I know.
Right. Until they hire these 87,000 people in the next decade.
Right.
That's exactly what I would think is, well, I have one 1099 for this much money and I have small expenses, over time. First year, totally. But like over time, you're only working for that one employer over 3-4 years. Kind of smells like an employee to me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. And so on the other side of it is, I've seen it where, and this can happen intentionally and unintentionally, where you end the relationship with the contractor and it either goes sour or something happens. And that, like, for example, what could happen is, if you have a contractor who you decide is not a good fit, you guys have been working together for a really long time, you have a great relationship, you're like, there's no way this person will ever hate me or do anything malicious to me. And then you have a falling out and you decide to end that relationship. They can go to the state they live in or the government and be like, file a claim and say, I was misclassified this entire time I was working. And what that can do is trigger a massive audit of everybody at your company, right?
Yes.
And so that can happen. And that's like the more malicious side, right? I like to think there's less of that, to be honest, than
they have to pay the taxes too. The employee that was misclassified also gets penalized for having to pay their taxes. So it's not exactly easy to go report that and kind of say, hey, we put us in trouble, right?
Right. But more of the unintentional one is, a lot of times people are uneducated about what unemployment benefits are. And so if you end a relationship and that's their most like significant income, they'll file for unemployment and they'll list you as an employer, not realizing the implications of that. And that can trigger a audit from the state level. Because what happens then is you, as an employer, will get a form from the state and you have to confirm wages and all of these things. And you're going to either one, not realize it and fill it out as though they were an employee because you don't know, or two, you're going to say they were never an employee of mine and send it back. And then there's this like story that doesn't line up, that the state's like,
Somebody's
oh,
lying to us. Like they get suspicious.
and
Yeah.
the state of California is like, you give me my money, right? And just kidding.
That should be like their tagline on their license plates.
Bitch better have my money.
Yes. California, give us your tax money.
So that can happen, right? And
Mhm.
you're dealing with humans, right? In relationships. And so whatever, like you think you have everything your relationship is moving in a very mutual, positive way. And then something happens and it can just trigger. So you just want to be mindful. Those are things that can happen, that it can be a big deal.
Yeah. And I wouldn't also wave that in front of your employer to say like, I'm just going to report you to the tax authorities or anything like that. Like it doesn't do anyone any good. But if you feel like you've been misclassified and you're missing out on opportunities, or you're not comfortable with that classification, there is a way to report that. But you want to be careful about knowing what you're doing and what that means for you and the employer at the end of the day, because you want to get that right. Because like with any audit, I used to be an auditor, and a bad audit results from people not telling the same story.
Right.
So if there's any inconsistency, that's where people just start getting suspicious when there's inconsistency. So you want to make sure you're doing that properly.
Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, like, it's not like being an employee is way better than not being an employee, right? Like there's not the best way. That's not like employers are like trying to take advantage of you by any means. It's just like understanding the different scopes of the roles and what you want to work on, as like, how do you want to be? Do you want to be a contractor that takes on more clients? Do you want to be an employee? Like, what relationship do you want? And making sure that you're clear about that when you're starting. Or if it changes while you're working together, right? That your relationship oftentimes can change from independent contractor to employee as workloads change, roles change, stuff like that.
Yeah. And expected commitment, right? So you could hire a freelancer and say, hey, I'm interested in having you on as an employee, like establishing a more permanent relationship and giving you more work that's under my supervision and control. And that makes total sense, especially understanding the state laws and what's required of that when you know where they're located. And here's one more thing about the states. It's where you're located and the contractor. So I'm based in Connecticut. I have a contractor in California. I am subject to the California employment laws as a result of that. So if that person's a contractor living in California, I have to be mindful of what is a contractor in California. So that's an interesting thing, especially in this global economy and this nationwide set of freelancers. You have to know what the implications are of hiring someone in a certain state. You don't want to discriminate, but also you have to be aware of like, I would, personally, I'm going, it's not looking good for California and New York contractors because people are scared to hire them because they're afraid they're going to get criticized for calling them contractors because the definition is so narrow.
Yeah. And also the same is true for international, right? It's less risky when you're hiring an international contractor because it just is. But what can happen is, like, let's say you hire somebody as a contractor in a country and then and it's incorrect and they find out, and then you want to open up an office in that country. Guess what? You've got to deal with that. So it's not I don't think it's as risky as here in as hiring contractors here in the United States, but it is something to think about.
Well, and there are rules in other countries too. Like I had someone I was talking to, a prospective client who was asking me about this, and I don't do much international, so it didn't work out. But what we were talking about was the fact that, apparently in, I believe it was Chile, you can't, like contractors can only work for an individual, not a business in the United States. So the person had to hire them personally, or they had to basically navigate how to make sure that they were compliant with those rules.
Mm,
So you also have to be careful of, what are the country's rules around contracting? And do I have a footprint in that country now as a business? There are
right.
all these things to consider.
And you don't want to get the person in trouble either,
No,
right? Like
no, I don't want
you
to
don't
send someone to like jail in another country for doing work for
exactly.
me. No,
Exactly.
we don't want
Exactly.
that.
Nope.
Uh, so Jackie, and one last topic to run through before we wrap things up is we were talking before we hit record a little bit about this, and it's really fascinating. The misunderstanding of when you're paying someone salary versus hourly, and how there's really more than like two choices there, or really
Oh
it's
my
not a
gosh.
question of salary versus hourly. Can you expand on that when it comes to paying folks?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's this conception of like full time means you get a salary,
Hmm.
right? And I just think when people are looking to onboard in team members, they think about salary full time versus or like salary versus hourly, and they equate it to how many hours somebody works. And that
Right.
is not how you should be looking at it. What you actually need to do when you're looking to bring on an employee is determine if they are a non exempt employee or an exempt employee. And that is not based on how much they make or how they're getting paid. It's based on the work that they're doing. And you can basically, a non-exempt employee is eligible for overtime,
Mm,
and they're also required different states have different wage and hour laws, and what that so you'd wanna look that up based on the state that you're in, and what that means is, for example and I know so much about California because I lived and worked in California for 10 years doing this, so that's why or 8 years, but, in California, for example, a non-exempt employee needs to take meal and rest breaks within certain hour-long windows, and you need to be able to prove that you were giving them to them. So they have to take a 30-minute lunch break within their first 5 hours of clocking in, and then they also need to be given 2 10-minute breaks. And so those don't have the lunch break doesn't have to be paid, but there's just different things you have to be able to do, right? And so a non-exempt employee is allowed those, and they get overtime, which also depends on the state. The federal government is overtime is time and a half, anything over 40 hours worked for the week. But different states have different requirements. For example, California, if you work over 8 hours in any day, that is considered overtime. If you work more than, and then also anything over 40 hours for the week is considered overtime. And if you work 7 days in a row, even if it's just 2 hours a day, 7 days in a row, that seventh day, all of those hours worked are double time. So you
wow.
need to know that because that's what happens when you have a non exempt employee in that state, right? And New
Right.
York has some laws. I think Colorado, you just have to know what that is. So that is what you need to determine, or I guess you need to determine based on the scope of the job, are they considered a non-exempt job or are they considered an exempt level job? And there's different exemptions, basically like tests you have to prove. And they're listed on the IRS website. You can just say, exemptions, IRS government, and it'll pop up. But
Yeah.
most of the jobs, are like an administrative or a professional exemption. And I feel like we could do a whole podcast episode on what
I
that means.
know.
So
I know
I
the
don't know that I want to
exemption.
get into that, but I mean, I
Yeah.
can, but um, you basically have to prove that they have judgment over their work. There's different things you have to prove out.
Yeah. There's so many factors. And when we talk about exemption, we're talking about exempt from overtime, meaning
Correct.
don't need to be paid overtime. So you can be exempt from overtime, meaning your SOL if you work more than 40 hours a week. So for my fellow Big Four accountants out there, we're exempt because we were working 70-hour weeks and not getting paid a dime more.
Everybody
So,
thinks, and what's so crazy to me is like when you're growing up, whatever, like
mhm,
you're
yeah,
like, oh, I'm paid a salary. I'm exempt now. I've made it. And I'm like,
no,
yo, I want to be hourly for my entire life. Like,
I was
I do,
making, I think, more at McDonald's per hour than if I broke down my Wall Street salary by hours.
I know. It's like these people are like, especially these young kids graduating, if you happen to listen to this, like becoming exempt is not like a promotion. It's not a sign you made it. It's like a we're gonna suck your life away and not pay you. Just kidding. That's not it.
No,
But
no.
you know what I'm
Sometimes.
saying. I'm making a joke, but it's like it doesn't mean you've made it, I guess. But
Yeah.
um
It's not a status symbol at all.
no, it's not. And unfortunately we've made it that way, the way that corporate works and all of that stuff.
Because they want you to believe that. They want you
And
to, exemption of from overtime generally benefits the employer because it means you don't have to pay you overtime for working more hours. But at the same time, a lot of these jobs command a higher salary. And a lot of
correct.
these jobs also, they're professional jobs, right? They're talking about lawyers, accountants, doctors, things like that, or like, well,
Managers, leader,
managers.
yeah.
Yeah. So generally, you're talking about a job that pays a really, really good salary. I'm just painting a broad brush, but so it's like, am I missing out on overtime? Maybe, but what would I make if I were in a different industry, right?
Mhm.
So it will
Totally.
always vary.
And usually the higher you go up in a role, like as you get promoted, usually there is this like level in which the scope of your job is so you're just doing a lot more work that qualifies for that. And that just increases as you get promoted. You're leading teams, you're leading functions, you're
Yeah.
doing more higher level strategic work, which tends to then not, have um not fall under that non-exempt status. So
Yeah.
the reason why that's important is because a lot of times people entrepreneurs that I talked with will be like, well, they're only going to work 20 hours a week, so they're a contractor. Well, that's actually not true. They might actually be a part-time employee, right? Like if you're setting the hours they have to work, for example, like customer service or administrative assistance. If this person is only working for you and you're requiring them to be online doing certain things for your business at certain times, they're probably a part-time employee, not a part-time contractor.
And when you say set hours, let me clarify. Set hours meaning like the number of hours per week or the
A
actual window of
schedule,
time?
a
Okay.
schedule.
Got it. Because there might be contractors where you say, I want you to work 30 hours per week for me. And that's fine. But it's more about, I want you to work, 8 to 4, Monday through Thursday,
Right.
that's more of the control, right?
Yeah, it's more like shift. Like if you think about it from like a shift work perspective,
Right,
like you're
right.
setting the specific times that they start and times that they stop.
Yeah. And because the environment is becoming so much more blurry and vague because of all these remote workers and freelancers, I think the government will be moving in a direction to crack down on misclassifications and narrowing the definition of contractor, because I think that people are taking advantage of, the classification of contractor and arguing it to get around paying payroll taxes. So I think we will see some stricter regulations coming out around that on the state levels and maybe even federal. They may even narrow that even further depending on how much they want to crack down and collect payroll tax.
I
And
I
we'll
also
see.
have a comment about that too,
Yeah.
is I do think, yes, employers are trying to get out of it, but I do think there's this big shift of people not wanting to be employees. They want to be contractors, right? There's a lot of people who are coming out of this, great resignation, starting their own businesses and doing their own thing. And so I think there's just going to be less payroll taxes as a result of that.
Agreed.
And so I think that will lead to it too. I do have one other thing to say that we didn't get into as it relates to non-exempt and exempt that I think is important.
Sure.
So first, it's the scope of the work that they do, right?
Mhm.
And if they are eligible for overtime or not. The second thing you have to know is there are set wages you have to pay for. There's an hourly wait or hourly rate, like minimum wage, right?
Right.
And there's a federal minimum wage, and then there's state minimum wages. Then there's also, and this is what most people don't realize, there is a set minimum salary that you have to pay. And so that's set by the government, or there's a federal one, which I think is like 35. I'd have
It's
to
like
look
the
it up.
minimum wage extrapolated to a year, right? Essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But so there's that. And then in certain states that number is higher than the federal. So
Right.
for example, next year in California, that number goes up to $63,000. That's what you have to
Wow.
pay in order to pay somebody a salary. Isn't that
Wow.
insane?
Full-time, part-time, any of it?
Any of it. The minimum salary exemption for I'm actually Googling it right now. People
So
can't
even
see.
if someone works like 10 hours a week for me, I have to pay them a minimum salary of 63,000?
No, but they have to
Okay.
track their hours and they would be eligible for overtime.
Okay.
You know what I'm
Got it.
saying?
Oh, I see. So if you wanted to have a exempt, is that if you want an exempt employee, that's
If
the
you
minimum to pay them?
Exactly.
Got
If you
it.
want it, yep, an exempt W-2 employee. And I'm sorry, I was wrong. It's
Oh my
$64,480.
God. So this just proves, guys, how complicated this can be because there's so many nuances to this, like
So many.
minimums and all these different things. Uh, I would definitely say don't go this alone in figuring this out because, or do your research, but I would also consult with a professional on this stuff to make sure you're within the bounds of the law because, Jackie, do you agree? A lot of missteps are truly unintentional just based on lack of
Yes,
awareness.
100%, 100%. And then what happened? Yeah, they're just, yeah, they don't know.
Yeah. And it's not your fault for not knowing. We weren't taught this. Why wasn't there a
Or
class on this?
I know, right? Well, I know. Or what also can happen is like there's not knowing, and then there's like good intent. Like a
Hmm.
lot of times these mishaps happen with you trying to be nice to the person. And then something happens and so it's tough. It's tough. But
Yeah,
yeah, I
it's
don't
tough
know
to
why there's not a
navigate.
class. I
Yeah,
mean,
hiring
I guess I
101.
had a class. Well, I do have a class actually that
Yeah.
I just launched, hiring school, um,
Yes.
that talks all about these things.
Perfect. So that's a great segue into
Mhm.
tell us about hiring school because if the last 10 minutes of this episode haven't convinced you that we probably need hiring school,
Yeah.
Jackie, tell us what's included in hiring school and what is it? Because I'm definitely interested in this.
So it's a full crash course on how to hire somebody into your business as a employee. And so I do recruiting for clients and they pay me a lot of money to do full cycle recruiting, anywhere from ten to $20,000 to fill a job. And obviously a lot of small businesses don't need that level of support or can't afford that. And so I created hiring school as a way to teach my process and what I know at a lower cost so that you can set up your hiring process and make your first couple hires along the way. And in there is how to figure out a job role that you need, how to really get clear on what you're looking for, how to write a job posting to actually attract good talent so that you're not just copying and pasting a job description out there.
Mhm.
Um, how to actually ask the right questions and a whole like the right questions to ask. There's training on there's actually bias that comes up in interviews and why following my method helps reduce that. And then it goes all the way through the job offer, what to, have people sign and all of that stuff. So
Perfect.
that is all that's included. And it's all video modules. They're short. They're maybe 10-minute videos max, but a lot of them are like 2-3 minutes. So easy to digest bites to walk you through.
And that's the perfect dose of each of these things because it's a lot of information and a lot of stuff that we don't know as business owners. We don't get a crash course in this stuff when we get our LLC or we start our first bank account. Like these should be kind of prerequisites. Like, hey, by the
Mhm.
way, welcome to business ownership. Here's your crash course.
Yep.
I love that. So, Jackie, where can folks learn more about either hiring school or what you're up to and what you're offering?
Yeah, for sure. So I do have a podcast as well called Hiring School.
Yep.
And so you can follow along there. I do have, and that's all from more of like my hiring training lens. My other bit, my consulting business is called People Principles. And so people can follow me there at People Principles on TikTok and on Instagram.
Perfect. We'll make sure all of that's linked in the show notes too. Jackie, any parting advice for our listeners when it comes to hiring their first or next team member?
Any parting advice? I guess
Mm.
like don't stress out too much. Like we just put a lot of stuff out there that I think
Yeah.
can scare people, and it's not as scary as it sounds. You just have to be aware of these things to look up. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't hire someone, right? It just
Absolutely.
means you should just be aware of the landmines that might be hiding.
Yeah, we
before
can tell
do
you,
it.
we'll tell you where the potholes and the landmines are to navigate around.
Exactly.
Perfect. Well, thank you for hopping on the show again and sharing your wisdom with everyone listening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always fun.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Talk soon.